Tim Hague Reads Books, presented by Tim Hague. Where are the political baby boomers? Where are the 50-year-olds in the front benches? The writer Alwyn Turner has spotted a fascinating statistical anomaly that the generation to which he belongs has produced significantly fewer front-rank politicians than those either side of it, or indeed any generation within living memory. Being a social historian, Alwyn was prompted to figure out why, and the answer is his e-book, Things Can Only Get Bitter. He identifies the pivotal 1992 general election as the crucial event and analyzes the impact on popular culture of a generation which turned instead to comedy, music, movies and publishing. By coincidence, Tim was of precisely the same generation, so it was more or less on the order of a certainty that he would need to get hold of Alwyn and ask him how come he had failed to become leader of the Conservative Party.
This is Tim Hague Reads Books, and my book today is Things Can Only Get Bitter by Alwyn Turner. Alwyn's an old friend of this series. Hello, Alwyn.
Good afternoon.
Just for once, I'm not going to shoot your fox and say what the basic idea of this book is. I'm going to ask you to.
It started from a realisation that there were no politicians of my age. I recently turned 50, and it seemed to me that somewhere around 2010, there was a sudden shift from people in power who were older than me to people who were suddenly 10 years younger.
You see, you spotted that. I'm almost exactly the same age as you, and I hadn't noticed.
Well, no, it occurred to me, and I thought, well, maybe this is just a perception. Maybe this is not the reality of it. And so I went and started looking at the statistics of people who had occupied the great four offices of state, and then cabinet ministers. And there is a very noticeable and dramatic drop in the numbers of people who were born between 1955 and 1964 who make it into the front rank of politics. And this is not simply because they're not old enough yet. They're already being overtaken as a group by those who were born in the following 10-year period, which is the Cameron, Clegg, Miliband generation. They followed on straight from the Brown-Blair generation. And there's a gap in the middle. And it's a particularly populous gap as well. The birth rate was rising. This is probably the largest cohort of births in British history. And they're just not represented in senior politics. And I was trying to work out why.
You can find, I think, precisely three people who've made it to the very front rank. There was William Hague, of course, who is
still with us.
Age, and Jackie Smith. Who
spent about 18 months, and Theresa May.
And that's essentially it.
Yeah.
Now, that doesn't mean that there weren't politicians.
No. There are other politicians, but as I say, even within the cabinet, I mean, branching out beyond those four into the cabinet more generally, there is a really steep fall-off of people. There is a definite phenomenon of a generation that is absent in politics, and it's the only time, having gone back through the figures for the last century, it's the only time that this seems to have happened. And it seemed to me intriguing to find out why that might be. And so the book is an attempt to explain what happened and where these people went.
Let's do that process then. Why do you think it is? What turned that generation? I mean, it's impossible that there was no talent in that generation.
Yeah.
There's you and me for a kid. So
it's a generation that's incredibly well represented in other fields, of course, in culture and in media. It's very, very powerful indeed. Just not in politics.
So why aren't we running the Labour Party?
The conclusion I come to is that this is to do with the experience of coming of age in the late 70s, early 80s, at a time of recession, and living one's entire adult life seemingly under a perpetual Tory government. That I start by saying if you're born in 1961, you would have reached the age of 18 in 1979 when Thatcher comes to power. And from then on, you've got another 18 years before anything changes. And it seemed a relentless series of defeats. If you were in any way inclined towards a left position, a liberal position even, the whole of the 80s, your entire young adulthood was spent being defeated.
But there have been other times, though, when a government's been in power for sort of 10, 15 years at a stretch. And that didn't discourage...
No, what I think it's it's a quantitative difference that it's not simply the 10 years, it's the 1992 election defeat, I think, is the crucial one. That it was 13 years at that stage since Margaret Thatcher had come to power. And there was a real sense in the 1992 election that this was the end of the Tory period.
Well, all the polls said it was going
Absolutely.
to be.
It felt like this was it. John Major was now the Prime Minister. He seemed defeatable, to put it mildly. And yet he wasn't. He won the largest vote ever recorded by a political party in British history. And there was a real sense in 1992, that general election, that was it. If the Labour Party couldn't win then, we'd had 2 years of a massive recession, which had been caused by a Conservative government. They couldn't claim that this was a position that they'd inherited from a Labour government. There hadn't been a Labour government not quite in living memory, but for a heck of a long time. It was clearly a recession of their own making. And even then, there was no chance of getting rid of them. It genuinely felt at that stage as though there would never be anything but a Tory government. It felt as if no victory could ever be achieved.
So that's the point, because in that 92 election, your sort of emblematic character who was born in 61 is 31.
Yeah.
Then. So if you were going to embark upon a political career, you'd probably already committed yourself to it by then. They must have withdrawn.
I think what was happening through that period is that the counterculture in the 1980s was incredibly diverse and creative, and a very, very rich area, but completely hidden from the mainstream. It was separated off, and I think that's what then became possible, was a sense that if we weren't going to break through in politics, then maybe we ought to be doing so in a cultural field instead.
Explore that a bit. In the book, you do go into some detail of the kinds of phenomena or creative works that you're talking about. Things like the sitcom Men Behaving Badly, things like Britpop coming through, and the magazines that catered for new laddism.
The New Lads, indeed, yeah.
Something I never really understood back then. New laddism. It never made any sense to me, but it does to you.
I think it was a genuine thing, and it was interestingly created by the people of the generation I'm talking about. It was people around the age of 30, people like James Brown, who was the editor of Loaded magazine.
Oh, you've got a lovely quote from him, haven't you? That Loaded was for men who had accepted what they were and they'd given up trying to improve themselves.
Absolutely, yeah. No, I think that was the sense of it. It was part of the experience of the 80s on the alternative side. I mean, there was a dominant mainstream culture that was celebrating the Gordon Gekko greed is good kind of angle, but there was a very large subculture that was primarily interested in fairly radical politics, and particularly identity politics, and feminism was very important. And there was a feeling by the end of the decade that it hadn't been much fun by the end of the 80s, and there was maybe life was passing by and it was time to just enjoy oneself. And I think that's what the New Laddism thing comes out of, is the attempt to just have a laugh and a beer and watch the football and give up trying to be a feminist man.
And call it ironic, though.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that's very important at that stage, is that somehow we're playing at being kids.
The Frank Skinner, David Baddiel approach, which is we're too clever to really be as depraved as this, but we're going to do it and enjoy it for the sensual pleasure.
And it is fun. But it's essentially playing at being an adolescent or a late adolescent.
So you identify a period of between that election 1992 and 1997, when the death of Princess Diana makes clear that something fundamental has changed in the outlook of the country. You're not allowed to be ironic about things anymore.
That's certainly true, but I think these things kind of concretise moments. I mean, the 92 election, I think the reaction against, the po-faced nature of the 80s had already started to manifest itself. 92 election makes it explicit. And I think Diana's death does the same with the reaction against that. And I think a lot of it is to do with, again, coming back to the politics of it, that it starts the cultural renaissance of the 1990s, which I think is a very genuine and impressive phenomenon. The music, the comedy, the art, the movies that were coming out, these were genuinely exciting times. They had a residual political element in that they were still in favour of diversity. Identity politics was still part of that, and a very, very strong anti-Tory core to it. Anti-conservative feelings were dominant.
You would
in
argue,
that.
in fact, that the country had voted Tory when they didn't really believe it, and that the country was had one outlook and had voted a government that was completely antithetical to them.
I think the country realised by the end of 1992 that it had made the wrong decision.
Well, Black Wednesday might have.
Black Wednesday was such a kicker.
Might have contributed, yeah.
And then there was just a series of own goals that the Tories seemed to indulge in on an almost weekly basis.
Imagine a Tory government scoring own goals.
Indeed. But once Black Wednesday had created that atmosphere of maybe they're not very competent after all, then suddenly things like Michael Heseltine's attempt to close down the mining industry suddenly became very, very serious and attracted a huge amount of opposition, which hadn't been there, of course, in the mid-'80s when the mining industry could have been fought for. You had VAT being imposed on domestic fuel. Again, I mean, who would imagine the Tories imposing VAT rises on an unwilling country? These things happened in a kind of cumulative fashion very, very rapidly. Once Black Wednesday had kicked away the foundation of the government's economic policy, everything else tumbled very, very, very quickly indeed. And I think the country had kind of given up and decided that, given that the party was going to be in power for the next 4.5 years at that stage, the country would just carry on without them effectively and reinvent itself.
And did. I mean, you make the point that all those progressive things like an acceptance of diversity and moving the country to a socially more tolerant position happened in the face of a Tory government.
Well, except it wasn't quite in the face of, because that implies an opposition. It was kind of almost just ignoring the government. It was just we'll get on with it on our own. We don't need your permission. And so there was a political content there, in that it was very strongly anti-Tory, but it wasn't aligned to the Labour Party at that stage, and there wasn't really much chance of it being aligned to the Labour Party while John Smith was the leader of the party, because John Smith was never going to look as if he really fitted in with a New Lad agenda or a Britpop agenda. I mean,
no.
Many things can be said in favour of John Smith, but he wasn't really part of that cutting edge of youth culture, really. And then, of course, in 1994, John Smith suddenly dies, and there's a new leader of the Labour Party who is very, very keen to align himself to this movement. And Tony Blair reinvents himself as the new Harold Wilson.
Tony Blair accent, this sort of "I'm not really posh" accent, in which you keep all the vowels but lose all the consonants.
Indeed, yes. No, it takes a good public upschool-bringing to get that proper. And there was, I think, very definitely a sense then that the cultural renaissance of the 90s was going to become part of the Labour campaign to be elected. And at that stage, it starts getting branded. Cool Britannia, particularly, comes into vogue in 95, 96. The art movements, which had been really quite interesting. I mean, again, in the 80s, the London art scene was a phenomenally diverse and interesting place. The early 90s, when people like Damien Hirst and Rachel Whiteread and Tracy Emin were coming through, a lot of very interesting work being done. By the mid-90s, it gets branded as the Young British Artists. And it's surprising how little work of any value has come since.
So, should we mind?
Should we mind that a generation has turned its back on politics and moved into other fields? To the extent that it produces some interesting cultural moments, then possibly not. I mean, it certainly enriches the country. I think it has a very poor effect on politics, because that influence that is then created in the cultural sphere means that the rejection of politics becomes more widespread. And I think that's when you start to see people turning away from politics altogether, right across the country. There is a crucial moment, it seems to me, in 2001 in the general election, when a government is elected for the first time in British history with fewer votes than the number of people who abstain from voting altogether.
And that is chilling. I agree.
That's worrying. There's the great Spike Milligan joke he used to say, one day the don't knows will win, and then where will we be?
And he was right.
They did. They won in 2001, and they won again in 2005. That was the effect of Blair's leadership of the country.
And then they went into coalition with the Tories.
Indeed, and you end up with some very, very peculiar situations with a by-election in Bradford where the three main parties between them can't even muster 50% of the vote.
The Lib Dems lost their deposit.
Indeed, and that's in terms of the vote. In terms of the actual the electorate itself, somewhere around 20% managed to vote for one of the three main parties. This is a very poor situation, and I do think it actually comes back to what happens when a generation opts out of politics and loses interest, and then spreads that lack of interest more widely amongst the population.
Well, I enjoyed this very much. It's a commendably short book, so we praise you for your continence. It's called Things Can Only Get Bitter, and subtitled The Lost Generation of 1992, by Alwyn Turner. It's an e-book. It's not available on the shelves.
That's correct. Just in download form.
So it's $2.99 as an e-book.
Or cheaper on some sites. You get it for under £2, less than the price of a Sunday newspaper.
Very good. So, Alwyn, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Tim Hague Reads Books is a Green Shoot production. You can find out more at www.green-shoot.com, and Tim can be contacted on tim@green-shoot.com.